Hey class, Bob Greavy here again. I wanted to wrap up this minimization problem and talk to you just for a second about something called surplus. In the last example, in the last video with the maximization problem, we talked about something called slack. And when you have less than or equal to constraints, you potentially have slack, or what's typically an unused resource. Well, when you have greater than or equal to constraints, you can have something called surplus. So if you have a greater than or equal to constraint, essentially it's saying you must at least use this many resources. And if you go above and beyond and use more than you need, then you have something called a surplus. As with slack, if you're talking about a binding constraint, again, those are the constraints that intersect to form the optimal solution point. Those are the constraints you're pushing to their limit. Then you will have no slack. Or I'm sorry, in this example, you'll have no surplus. So in the green and the blue constraints, we have no surplus. The left-hand side of the constraint adds up to the right-hand side of the constraint. We have pushed that constraint as far as we can. But this red constraint should have a tiny bit of surplus because it is not binding. It is not at that intersecting optimal solution point. However, visually we can see it's darn close, so the surplus will probably be pretty minimal. We can figure out the surplus just as we did figure out the slack by calculating the difference between the left-hand side and the right-hand side with the optimal solution. So let's figure out the surplus real quick. The constraint says 2 times x1, which we now know to be 3.2, plus 5 times x2, which we now know to be 0.8, must be greater than or equal to 10. Must be at least 10. So when we plug that in, we get 2 times 3.2 is 6.4, plus 5 times 0.8 is 4, and we get 10.4 must be greater than or equal to 10. So it is in fact greater than or equal to 10, but just barely. And the difference there, or the 0.4, is called surplus. Okay, so that's surplus. So to review, if you have a less than or equal to constraint, which you always have in a maximization problem, those constraints can have slack. If you have a greater than or equal to constraint, as you typically do in a minimization problem, those constraints can have surplus. Okay, the slack or surplus is just the difference between the left hand and the right hand side of the constraint.